The Hittite Warrior by Joanne Williamson, Chapter 2. The Merchant from Tyre. Canaan was only a name to me, like its neighboring land of the Amorites. Not too long ago, as the years are counted, we of the great Hittite conquered and possessed all those lands to the south, though Egypt had claimed them. And we in the accursed land had fought for them over the years till the battle of Kadesh, when the boundaries were finally settled. After that we had ruled the northern lands of Canaan, while Egypt had ruled in the south below, the town of Damascus, and there had been an uneasy peace between us. Harosheth, I knew, was in the part of Canaan ruled by Egypt, and I shuddered to think what might await me there. For all Hittites knew that only evil could come out of Egypt, and that all Egyptians were cruel and treacherous beyond belief. Besides, all Hittites knew that the Canaanites themselves were cowardly and dishonorable men, who set lowly merchants above honest warriors, and who taught their children to read and keep accounts, instead of fighting for what they wanted. But my father had said that I was to go to Harosheth, and I had given him my promise. I thought that I would never get to Canaan in any case, no matter what I had promised, for I had no money and little food to last on a journey. I must travel on foot, for no horses or donkeys had been left to us at home. I found a caravan made up of traders from Canaan, who bowed and smiled at the new Achaean masters of Havilah, as they had smiled and bowed to my father before. But we Hittites were no longer their masters. Now they shouted at me and thrust me aside when I tried to speak to them, for I was shabby and poor, and one of the conquered race. So I could not find out where in Canaan they were going. But I could not stay in Havilah, so I kept as close to the men of the caravan as I could, and as they left town, followed in their shadow. I remember little of those first days of the journey. The road was hot, stony, and dusty, and it burned and bruised my feet. The sun grew stronger and crueler as we moved southward, so that I was often dizzy and always thirsty. There was water for all, but my small supply of food was growing smaller, and though I ate as little as I could, I knew that it would soon be gone, and that I would be left to die a beggar. My thoughts often wandered, and sometimes it seemed that I had been walking along that highway all my life, though I could not tell where or why. It was on the fourth night that the robbers came down upon us. We had halted for the night at a canvassary along the way. The merchants and their servants had crowded themselves into the dark, bare building that surrounded the courtyard, where their supplies and merchandise were loaded. But I stretched myself in the open, preferring the company of animals and stars. For if the Canaanite merchants held me in scorn, I returned the feeling with all the strength I had left. I lay on the ground in my threadbare robe, listening to the soft sounds made by the beasts, donkeys mostly, and goats brought along for their milk. There were no horses. The traders in this caravan rode on donkeys, or, if they were rich enough, in sedan chairs carried by servants. I thought with longing of the horses I had known at home. I remembered other nights when I had slept in the open with the young colts, with Labernash. Labernash, I whispered, where are you now? But I thought that he was probably dead. The moon was bright, but there were shadows all around me. If my ears had not been dulled by hunger and weakness, I would have heard the sound before. But I did not hear it till the new shadow fell across me. I turned my head and looked up into a dirty, brown, bearded face. It was twisted and ugly. At the same time that I saw it, I saw that a hand was raised above me and that there was a knife in it. I rolled aside, and the knife came down on the spot where I had been an instant before. As the man sprawled in surprise, I gathered myself together and sprang upon him. I was sick from weariness and lack of food, and I would never have been so strong if all the rage of the past 3 years had not come upon me. I wanted to kill this strange man, because if I did not, I knew he would kill me, but also because the sea people had killed my mother and sister, destroyed my home, beaten my father to death, and because the Canaanite merchants no longer bowed to me, but pushed me aside and treated me like a serf. So I fell upon him from behind, seized him by the wrists, and twisted his arms behind him till he screamed and the knife fell from his hand. Then we both struggled for it on the ground, and I was the one who got it. He tried to force it from me, but he, being a robber, was probably not much stronger or better nourished than I was, and I was so full of hate that it served me better than a well-fed body. So I broke his grip, threw him to the ground, and then fell upon him again and plunged his own knife into him until he was dead. There had been wild men like this one at home who would rob and kill when they could. So I knew that he was probably a lookout sent ahead of his band to see if the men in the caravan were asleep and to kill any guards. I knew the other bandits had probably heard his scream and would be down upon us. So when I saw that he was safely dead, I stood up and shouted to those inside the caravanserai. Hello, I shouted, you lazy fat ones in there. Stand up if you can and pick up your weapons. Somebody else is after your silver. I made a lot of noise and shouted many more unflattering things, enjoying myself for the first time in 3 years. The merchants had probably heard the scream of the robber too, so they all came piling out, armed with their staves and their bronze and jeweled daggers. I burst out laughing at the sight of them. They came just in time, however, for, as I expected, the robber band now came pouring down, shrieking fearfully, laying about them with sticks and shooting stones from slings. It was not much of a fight. The robbers were poor, simple-minded, hungry men, stupid from starvation, and though the traders were not very good fighters, as we would have counted it in our Zawa, they were well-fed and armed and quick-witted. So they soon drove them off and sent them howling away into the countryside. But before they did so, one of the merchants nearly lost his life. He was a young man who handled his stave fairly well, but one of the robbers got past it and would have cut his throat if I had not seen what was happening. I felt no love for the young merchant, but was not on the side of the robbers, so I came up behind the bandit and struck him a tremendous blow over the head with a stick I had picked up. So the young man's life was saved. The last robber was sent running off to join his fellows, and peace settled down upon us again. It had been a great night for me. I thanked the gods for letting me prove myself worthy of my training at home. I had fought well and saved a life, together with much valuable property. Now, if I must be left along the roadside to die, at least I would not die in shame. I fell into a deep, restful sleep. In the morning, before the caravan set out again, a very dirty donkey boy came to me and said his master wanted to see me. It was the first time any of them had spoken to me except in anger, and remembering that I was the son of a Hittite lord, I tried to make myself as clean as possible. I even took the trouble to braid my hair. I ate the last of my food supply to give myself strength, then followed the donkey boy to the man who wanted to see me. It was the young man whose life I had saved. I had noticed him before, for he was one of the magnificent ones who rode in a sedan chair with cushions and carved ivory fittings carried by 4 strong men. I had seen such things only before in Hittite, and very few of them at that. He was not much older than I was, and as handsome as the Canaanite god Adonai, with white teeth and the beginnings of a young beard. He wore a fine cone-shaped hat, beautifully made sandals, and a robe and a tunic, bordered in the deep, bright purple that had been worn by the royal family in Hittite. Besides this, he carried an elegantly carved walking stick. I tried to hold him in scorn, but I could not help admiring him. "You have done a great thing for me," he said, after staring at me for a little while. "Are you a free-born man?" "My father," I said proudly, "was a lord and a kinsman of the chief of the province of Arzawa. And you," I added to myself, "are nothing but a buyer and seller of goods, and your people have never been anything but the slaves of stronger nations." But the young man could not hear that, what I said to myself. He smiled a wonderfully bright, sweet smile. "In that case," he said, "you are my brother, for you have saved my life. Have you food for the rest of the journey?" I was ashamed, but I told him the truth. "Then you will share mine," said the young man, and to prove that he meant it, he had his servant bring me a skin of goat's milk, from which I drank heartily, and some honey cakes to go with it. Never having met anyone like this magnificent person before, I was silent at first and waited to see what he would say to me. "My name is Hannibal ben Ebal," he said, when I had finished my milk and cakes. "My father is an elder of Tyre." I had heard of Tyre. It was a city on the coast of Canaan, not so big and thriving as Sidon, its neighbor to the north, but a rich, powerful town. Like most of these cities, it was ruled by Egypt, but governed by its own chief, high priest, and the council of elders, all chosen from among the great merchant families of the town. Hannibal, it seemed, was making his first trading journey with his caravan to practice the arts of buying and selling his father's goods in foreign lands. "Then this caravan," I said, "is headed for Tyre. Is Harosheth far from Tyre?" "Harosheth?" Hannibal frowned in surprise. "What have you to do in Harosheth?" I told him of my father's death and the reason for my journey into Canaan. "I am sorry for what happened to your father," said Hannibal, "though we in Canaan have no reason to love the Hittites. But," he added, "you will find little peace or safety in Harosheth." "Why not?" I asked him. "Because it is a hill town," he said, "inland in Canaan. They say it is the fiercest and cruelest town of all. They are rough and lawless there in the hills, and the country is full of robbers and rebels. They fight among themselves, and 10 years seldom goes by that one of the cities has not destroyed one of the others. They have not our wealth and trade, you know, so they are not so well protected by Egypt as we are on the coast." I wondered, if the inland cities were always at war with one another, how I could be sure that my father's friend was still alive. "All the same," I said, "I must go to Harosheth. I have given my promise." "Well, you must rest in Tyre first," said Hannibal. "My father is an honorable man, and he will not let you go without rewarding you for saving my life. Stay close to my supply train and take what food you need." When we come to Tyre, my servants will guide you to my father's house." The signal was given for the caravan to set out again. Hannibal but Ebal was lifted in his chair on the shoulders of his 4 husky bearers, and I steered after him, bewildered and uncertain. Then I followed after his supplies and his donkey boys. I could not understand this sudden burst of fortune that had come upon me, and could not really believe that any good could come to me, a Hittite, at the hands of a Canaanite trader. But at least I had food now, and I knew that I was not going to die on the road to Canaan. Chapter 3. The House of Ebal. The caravan followed the great king's highway into Canaan by way of Damascus, into a land of many hills and valleys and rocks, swift streams and awesome forests, and a great snow-capped range of mountains towering over all. Many people seemed to live there, for the road was crowded at times, especially as we moved farther south. There were fields and villages and towns all along the way. Having stopped for some light trading at the bustling town of Damascus, we turned westward towards the sea. The land was smoother there, and it was not long before we passed the high, gleaming walls of Canaan's great city of Sidon. And for the first time in my life, I smelled salt in the air, and I heard in the distance the sound of surf rolling in on the shore. And then, soon after, we came to Tyre. The town of Tyre was on an island, approached by a narrow causeway from the beach. To come to the causeway, we had to pass through a tangle of miserable hovels of brick and mud, huddled about the shore. Never before, even in the worst villages at home, had I seen such dirt and smelled such smells. The huts were so crowded together that I wondered that the people who lived in them had room to breathe, much less move. But then we came out upon the causeway, and all the great sea was around us, and before us the golden, towered wall of the city with its well-guarded gate. Soldiers watched us as we passed through. They seemed to be 2 different kinds, and one kind I had never seen before. They were slim, very dark, clean-shaven, and they wore nothing, it seemed, but brightly patterned kilts belted about the waists. "What sort of man is that?" I asked the donkey boy. "They are Egyptian soldiers from the garrison," said the boy indifferently. "They help our temple guards keep order, and they see the city pays its taxes to Egypt." I made a sign against evil. This was the first Egyptian soldier I had ever seen. Never had I seen so many people crowded together as within the walls of Tyre. People thronged about the outdoor shops set up in the streets of the bakers, jewelers, vegetable sellers, and the rest. Street musicians hung about, playing their instruments and looking for silver. Some of the streets were little more than alleys, and it was hard to push your way through them. There were few horses and chariots about, but many donkeys and sedan chairs and simple carts. In the middle of all this, we came upon an open place, which was a building surrounded by a courtyard. "Is this the temple of Melkarth?" I asked the donkey boy, for Melkarth was the Baal, or patron god of Tyre. The donkey boy shook his head, and to my surprise, he shuddered a little. "No," he said, "this is the temple of Moloch." And he shuddered again with a cringing reverence in the direction of the building. He said no more. A cold, strange feeling had come over me as I looked at it, and I did not know why, for the building itself was not ugly. Hannibal had told the donkey boy to guide me to his father's house, and he had given me a letter for his father, written on a tablet of clay, to explain my arrival, for he himself had first to go to his father's warehouse. I looked with scorn at the marks on the tablet. The house of Ebal was made of bricks and wood, and was 3 stories high, with a beautiful columned door. A servant took my letter, leaving me to stand in amazement in the entryway, gazing upon the splendor of bright tiles and ornaments and beautiful rugs. Though the furnishing were few, they were simple. This was surely a great house of the city. The servant returned with a message of welcome, and as I was hot and dirty, I was shown to a room at the top of the house, in which a shallow tub and another servant poured hot water upon me. This gave me great pleasure, and the scrubbing I gave myself with soda powder set my blood to racing, so that when it was time for the evening meal, I found that I was ready to face these strangers unafraid. Ebal himself met me, and when I came to the common room from washing myself, I saw he was a small, elderly man, very thin and seeming never to be at rest. His hair was gray, and he had a stringy beard, too thin to be held in a net, as were the beards of many of the Canaanite men. But his eyes were sharp and kind, and he was resolved to make me welcome for his son's sake. "The young Hittite," he said, "there are many of you about now, fine young men, with fair skins and good strong noses. You will make your way in Canaan, all of you. I must embrace you, for now you are a son of the family." And he did so, and he led me to where the others waited. "My mother," he said with the greatest respect, "the Lady Maris, whose youngest and only living son I am. She is the woman of the house, for my wives are dead." I bowed to the Lady Maris, who was very old and wrinkled and dressed with great richness, A mantle covered her white hair, and heavy gold ornaments hiding her fingers and hanging from her ears. She leaned on the arm of a young girl who also wore gold rings and earrings and a golden headband. She was called Ebal and was the old lady's granddaughter, the youngest child of Ebal. A young man stood behind her in the shadows, watching me angrily with large dark eyes. I thought at first that he was another of Ebal's sons, but Ebal called him his kinsman, and I saw that his eyes were just as angry when he looked at the others. He did not speak to me. His name was Jotham. And Ebal said that he came from the south of Canaan, somewhere near Jerusalem, the town of the Jebusites. My son is kept late at the warehouse, said Ebal, but you are hungry, so we will not wait for him. We seated ourselves on small Egyptian rugs about a low table, and Ebal invoked the blessings of Adonai the Lord, and El the Almighty, all the Baals in general, and Baal Melfkarth, patron of Tyre in particular, upon our meal. It was a fine meal, with roast pigeon, artichokes, and strange, tempting cakes. There was wine, too, although the mother of Ebal drank beer instead. Ebal explained to me this was because she had come from Egypt, where beer was the favorite drink. So the mother of Ebal, too, was an Egyptian. I looked at her with uneasy eyes. Ebal leaned toward me and spoke in a low voice. The family of my mother once lived in Hittite, the accursed city. Her father's father was brought up as a child near the court of the criminal pharaoh, and her grandmother could remember his brother, the young Tutankhamun. I did not know what he was talking about. I knew nothing of any Egyptians except that wicked Ramses had fought us at Kadesh, and the very thought of that great and hated land was dark and awesome mystery. The mother of Ebal had raised her head, and I could see how bright her eyes were among the old dark wrinkles of her face. He was no criminal, she said in her old whispering voice. He was the true Pharaoh, the true and beautiful child of Adonai. There are no true pharaohs on the throne of Egypt now. There was an embarrassed silence. Then the young girl called Ebal spoke briskly. My grandmother is very old, she said, and she can say what she likes. Her grandmother told her many stories of the accursed city. It is so long ago that most people have forgotten it, and we need not be ashamed. It smelled of flowers, said the old woman stubbornly. Now Ebal found his voice and changed the subject. Tell me of yourself, my son, he said to me. Hannibal said in his letter that your father was a man of property in Great Hittite. What did he raise on his land? Wheat and barley, I said. We had many orchards and kept bees, but mostly we raised horses on the grasslands. I swallowed hard, for my throat had tightened with a longing for home. Ebal was impressed. Chariot horses, he asked. Eagerly, war horses. The finest, I replied, remembering Larbernash. If that could be done here, cried Ebal, raising his hands. But this poor land is mostly orchards and sheep. Still, we do a good business from the wool. Show him, Ebal. The girl Ebal rose with pride and came for me to touch the cloth of her robe. It was finer and softer than any material I felt before. From our workshops, said Ebal, the finest. You see that it is bordered in the Canaanite purple. Only here can the purple dye be made. She jingles when she walks, said Jotham scornfully. And it was true, for there were silver ornaments at her wrists and ankles. But Ebal only smiled at him. It was the first time he had spoken. He seemed a strange young man, but everything in this house was strange to me. I was pleased to hear Hannibal's voice in the entryway, for he at least was not a stranger. I saw him through the door, giving his walking stick to a servant and having his hands and feet washed. He greeted me happily after having embraced Ebal and bowed to the grandmother, and I could not help being warmed by his sweet smile and gracious manner. Ebal was overjoyed to see him, and I could see that he was the pride of his heart. He is all that is left to me, he said. There were 4 other sons, one who might almost have been a grandfather himself now if he had married young. But he was a firstborn. Here he stopped, and an uncomfortable silence fell upon us. I did not understand what the trouble was, but for some reason I felt the same cold feeling that had come upon me once before that day, near the temple of Moloch. But Ebal did not say what had become of his firstborn son. 2 others were lost at sea, he continued, and another of the plague, like my wives. Hannibal is all that is left, but he will bring me honors, I have no doubt. He was silent for a moment, and then as if shaking off some deep sadness, he turned to me, saying briskly, And you, my son? What are your plans in Canaan? Are you a good man of business? Can you keep accounts? They were all smiling at me in encouragement, and I felt my face grow hot. I cannot read, I said at last. There was shocked silence, and I began to frown. Bookkeepers, traders, I thought angrily. Who but low-caste priests and servant scribes could read or write? High-born Hittites had better things to do than spend their lives over 1,000 signs and pictures and learn to make marks in clay. But Hannibal was smiling again. Here in Canaan, he said, it is necessary for a man of position to read and write. It is not as it is in Great Hittite, where the sacred picture writing is a mystery in itself. Here we have an easy way, only 22 signs, from which all words may be formed. You will learn quickly." "I do not care to learn," I said rudely. "I am not a scribe." The young man Jotham snorted, but the others were patient with me still, explaining that in coastal trading cities, a man who could read and write and keep accounts could rise to great wealth and power. "There is work you could do for me here in Tyre," said Ebal. "But I am going to Harosheth," I answered. "You cannot go there for a while," said Hannibal. "There will be few caravans, for they say there is trouble again in the hills. So you'll have time to learn many things here." And his face alight, he talked for a long time of the wonders of the business of his father's possessions, farms where sheep were raised, workshops where cloth were woven, ships to carry the produce to the far corners of the world, and a coppersmithy. Ebal listened to all this, nodding his approval, and I wondered if Hannibal would talk through the night. At last, however, his father stopped him, saying that it was late and that prudent men did not waste oil in their lamps, and that it was time for prayers and offerings before bed. And now a thing happened that surprised me more than anything I had yet seen. At mention of prayers, Jotham rose from his rug and walked from the room. The hair rose on the back of my neck, for I thought no man in his right mind would refuse to honor the gods. Though the gods had not protected me, I still feared them. Ebal saw my look of horror and said to me, "Jotham must be forgiven. He has suffered greatly, and a man whose birthright has been stolen must always be bitter." And he added under his breath, "Those scoundrels down in Gaza." We said our prayers and made our offerings of incense before the household images, and a little gold statue of Astarte, the sacred mother. Then, as the lamps were burning low, we went to bed. I found that I must share a room with Jotham, and I decided that sooner or later I must speak to him. I did not know what to say, for though he seemed to be a Canaanite lord, there was something different about him. "Tyre is a fine city," I said, at last, out of politeness. "It is a den of evil," replied Jotham. I decided to try again. "The people," I said, "are very kind to strangers." Jotham laughed. "Ask the strangers who make their purple dye how kind they are." But I said, "How is it that you, who are one of them, should speak like that?" To my amazement, he gave me such a savage look that I stepped back away from him. "I am not one of them," he said. After this, he would not speak at all, and after a while he slept, leaving me to listen to the shouts of quarrelsome voices and the rattle of cartwheels outside and to dream of the silent plains of Arzawa.